Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Lisa Calvente, to discuss intercultural communication, hip-hop music, and resistance. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you. I know that you've got a book chapter coming out, right? It's available digitally right now. It's about to go into print. And this is the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Studies, right? And your article is called "I'm Ready to Die." Tell us about this this book, this Oxford Hip Hop Studies book. I think that's an unusual title. What's it about?
Well, the book itself is created by two editors, one of which works in New York on music, and the other who is a musicologist. And what they were doing was trying to kind of bring together voices on hip hop, but really politicize the music, right? And focus on how hip hop can really look at the power structures in the world right now and really kind of shed light on what we can do in terms of social justice. Now, not every single chapter focuses on that, but they do focus on power, culture, and communication, how music communicates, right? Either oppression or resistance. I decided to do both.
Very good, okay. And I understand this is kind of a way for you to connect your Ph.D. studies and your professional research with your experience growing up in New York, right?
Yes.
Tell us where you grew up and who you met.
Well, I'm originally from Brooklyn, but my family is from Spanish Harlem. So we are New Yorkers, okay, right? So we are from the island of Manhattan, not from the actual islands, right? And so basically when I was in college, I, had a choice. I was into music, in the music industry, going to clubs, interning a bit for Universal. And I was also in college in a number of programs that were geared towards minorities, for the most part, going into academia. And so I had a choice, either go into academia or go into music. And what I wanted to do really was go into the academy and join this revolutionary think tank, right? And, this revolutionary think tank of faculty or people of color, really. So I was very young in my thinking in terms of revolution at the time. But I wanted to do that. But I also didn't want to leave hip hop or music or what that meant behind. So that's why when I went to graduate school, I focused on cultural studies and communication studies.
And you were actually in Brooklyn during the peak of the hip hop era, right?
I was, yes.
And you met some of the people that
yes,
you write about, of course, right? One being the notorious B.I.G, right?
Absolutely, right? And it's interesting today that now we have coined the term the notorious R.B.G, right? Naming all of the kinds of revolutionary movements that women have done after a hip hop artist who was gunned down, right? Who was at one time the epitome of the representation of violence and what was so wrong with hip hop, right? So it's interesting how this has come full circle for me, right? In terms of the importance of hip hop being, something that could go against white supremacy and racism here in the United States, here in the Western world.
So what was this atmosphere like? It fascinates me to be talking to somebody who was around while all this was brewing.
I must say it was not easy, right? So while I write about what I think many hip hop scholars write about, right? Or scholars who are invested in popular culture and popular music, and then they write on hip hop. While I write on neoliberalism and how hip hop comes to be, in that second piece and later on in my manuscript, I really focus on the 90s, right? And the reason why I focus on the 90s is because when we think about the birth of neoliberalism, or the context of neoliberalism in the 70s, in the 80s, so the late 70s, 80s, Reaganomics, you don't actually see the effects of that until the 90s, right? Now we're starting to hear all of these other kind of markers of how important the 90s was, right, in terms of the 1994 crime bill, right, in terms of hyper-incarceration, right, the targeting of Black and brown bodies. So when you're growing up in the 90s, I was a teenager, you face, right, what is kind of part of everyday life, which is police brutality, police crimes, right? Continuously being surveilled, continuously being policed as, you know, young, brown, Black women and men, right?
Yeah.
So that's one part of it. But the other part is really kind of finding these connections with other young people.
Yeah, there was a strong sense of community there, right?
Yes, absolutely, right? So I was a latchkey kid. Do people know what a latchkey kid is?
I do. I was
days?
one myself, yes.
So I was a latchkey kid, and
We might have to define neoliberalism, but I think we can live with latchkey.
okay, good. So I was a latchkey kid. I, you know, hung out with other latchkey kids, right? And it seemed as if this was the norm.
Yeah.
And the thing is, when you live in a space where, you know, the structures, education, for example, the infrastructure, so going to school in public transportation and the police are stopping you and frisking you, and then you go to school and the teachers don't like you and you learn about how you're either invisible or the enemy, right? You tend to feel, right, excluded, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't belong, or, you know, like you don't matter, like you were better off dead, right? Which is basically what the Notorious B.I.G.'s first album is about.
Yeah,
I'm ready
those are
to
themes,
die,
yeah.
right? And what you realize is that people, you know, Marx was right when he said that we are social creative beings, right? Because regardless of that kind of terror that happens every day, and by no means it does not compare to the terror of colonization and enslavement, right? But those kinds of remnants of terror, right, that young people faced in the 90s actually had some kind of excess, right? And that excess was their connection together, right? That sense of belonging.
Yeah.
So while we didn't see ourselves in, you know, history books, unless we were the enemy, unless, you know, we were the enslaved, we were the ones who were wiped out, we did see ourselves,
Yeah, you did see yourselves
right?
in music, yeah.
And we saw ourselves not just in music, but in each other. We finally had that space, right, of imagining.
And these people were playing at clubs that you went to, and so you would see them on the street, right? It was the community was not a pretend community. It was an actual community.
It was not a pretend community, right? So this was even before the 90s, right? So it would be the late 80s. And hip hop artists typically, you know, at least the ones that I saw, were playing in what was formerly or actually even at the time, were rock clubs,
Yeah.
right? Because that's what was popular at the time, right? So my first hip hop artist that I saw, it was like teen night. And so at this point, rock was kind of fading away because, you know, the city was really kind of focused on getting rid of drugs. You know, I saw LL Cool J at Club Lemoore, which was in Bensonhurst, right?
Yeah.
And it was a rock club on teen night. And he came out there and he was, you know, a young person himself, older
Yeah.
than me, but still a teenager.
Yeah,
right?
really?
And and maybe 20 at the most,
Yeah.
right? And he performed, right? In
Now, when
front
you
of
were
all these
hearing
young
these things
people.
for the first time, did you find yourself thinking, I can't believe he's saying that, right? Were you, you know, because this escalated, right? The language, the earthiness of it, right? To put it in a nice way, right?
You mean the vulgarity?
The vulgarity of it. Okay, we can put it that way.
Right? No. No.
Yeah.
Right? So one, I was never like, I can't believe Notorious B.I.G. or, you know, Tupac said X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
because I said the same things as a kid,
Yeah.
right? Growing up, we shared the same language.
But it's something unique to somebody be saying that on stage all of a sudden, don't you think?
Oh, I understand what you're saying.
You know, I mean, you know, there's this great moment at the Woodstock movie where Country Joe gets ready to do his "Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die" rag, and he goes to the audience, "Give me an F," and you know, they spell out a word that wasn't allowed to be.
Yes, I mean,
Yeah,
was it unique? It was empowering.
yeah, yeah.
Right? It was empowering because I think while I probably didn't understand it at the time,
yeah.
what I felt was empowerment.
Well, and this was, you know, in another sense, this is part of a free speech movement, right?
Yes.
That goes back to Berkeley, and Country Joe, by the way, was part of that, which is one of the reasons he injected that into his performance.
No.
And so what I was getting at is sort of this escalation of being able to say things that you hadn't said before, and maybe the you know,
And not just
the shock value of it, but apparently it didn't have shock value.
for the young
its
people,
origins,
no,
no,
it was affirming. It
Yeah.
affirmed that not only are you living,
Yeah.
but other people that were in front of a camera,
Yeah.
right, being filmed, being represented,
Yeah.
were saying what you felt,
Yeah.
right? Because all of a sudden you had someone listening.
Okay, so now you're writing about Notorious B.I.G., right? Before we start using language that's going to get us thrown off the air.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. So you're writing about Notorious B.I.G. in this Oxford article. And what did you have to say about him? You talked about his communication.
His
theme
first,
in
yes. So his
music, right?
first
Yeah.
album was called Ready to Die. And I begin, of course, talking about his death, right?
Yes.
And his death came after Tupac was shot and killed. And of course, I think the most popular thing between Tupac and the Notorious B.I.G., at least in mainstream media, was that hip hop was nihilistic, and they were the examples of nihilism within hip hop culture. And of course, the examples were their death, if you will, right? And what I argue is that really Ready to Die is a setup for Black becoming, right? Really becoming and embracing Black love, right? In a world where, as I had said earlier, in a world where you were taught to hate Blackness, right? So it's really a clever way of using negative representations of Blackness to talk about Black positivity and sociality.
Yeah. Interesting. And when you say hip hop culture, you're referring to something broader than that, I assume, right? Can
Yes.
you walk us through that?
So what I aim to do in my work on popular culture, on specifically hip hop culture, is really divide this kind of combining of both Black representation and on the ground hip hop politics. And what I find that people do is kind of combine the two, right? Perhaps because we don't know, or because these kinds of representations of Blackness are already rooted in a long history of racism and white supremacy, right? So you can kind of tie, right, hip hop and hip hop representation to, images even prior to the moving image, right, as Black as criminality, right? And of course this happens when during Reconstruction and after enslavement, right? And so what you see here is this long line of representation: Black criminality, Black is bad, etc. This can even, if we get out of the United States, you can tie this all the way to colonization and enslavement, period, right? And what I want to do is kind of talk about representation on the one hand, but then really talk about this magical connectedness on the other, right? The ways in which hip hop allows us alternative possibilities to the modern world that we know today.
Well, and one of the things that's especially interesting about this is that it's done through art, right? And this, to get back to the song for a second, right? You were saying that it's a sort of a suicide note in the form of a phone call that references and samples communication. I thought that was really worth going into a little bit. Can you describe that for everyone?
Yeah, so
The name of the song again is?
Suicidal Thoughts.
Yes, okay.
So Suicidal Thoughts is one of the less popular songs in the Ready to Die album. And while the lyrics focus on really Big's suicide note, right? The music is the focus. The fact that he centers on the telephone call, calling Puff Daddy, his friend, right? Who's asking him not to end his life, right? So there you have this understanding that even in Suicidal Thoughts, even with Big killing himself at the end, what this song sets up is really conversation, love, right? Love between two friends, or even the possibility of redefining family, the possibility of disrupting heteronormativity, right? Because it's two young men, right, one at least expressing his love for someone else who's ready to die, right? Who can't take life anymore. And using the telephone as technology, as the technology of the times, and communicating actually creates this ongoing dialogue about Black death, right? And about how this kind of community, this sense of belonging, can pull you from suicidal thoughts, right? Because we have to understand that Ready to Die, while that's his first album, and he does end with Suicidal Thoughts, he already, right, had a second album in mind, right? Which, was Life After Death. So it already tells you this is a sense of becoming, right? And of course, at the time, we didn't know that it was going to be life after death, right? This is after the fact. But what he does do is open up that possibility of becoming, right, through love, through Black affirmation. So one of the most important things for me that hip hop does is really show that you can embrace and love Blackness and there are other ways to be in the world that are positive and productive, right? That are alternative to assimilating into what we have today.
The song has a lot of sampling in it and noises, and
Yes.
those take up most of the song, right?
Yes.
What's that all about?
Well, I think, for that, number one, I mean, Ready to Die, and I'm biased, I am from Brooklyn, in the 90s, met B.I.G. Ready to Die is a hip hop or a musical masterpiece, right?
All right.
So he gives, and what I try to do in my pieces on hip hop is really steer away from kind of lyric analysis, right? Because what you continue to see over and over again, and I'm not saying let's not talk about music at all, but what you continue to see over and over again is kind of like a rhetorical analysis of what the lyrics are saying, or political, textual analysis. So political scientists do this as well with hip hop lyrics. But
if we were looking
the
at poetry,
music,
we wouldn't be looking at it strictly as that, right?
exactly,
Yeah,
right?
because it's
And
art,
you
yes.
cannot ignore the sounds that come with it, right? So with Suicidal Thoughts, for example, what you have is a real centering or highlighting of the sounds around the lyrics themselves, right? So lyrics are actually secondary to, for example, sampling Miles Davis, or even sampling, the old operator voice, please hang up and try again, right? Like, and you hear that at the end. So, it's really about all these kinds of sounds, right? That either you experience as a child prior to your teenage years, right? Or you never experienced, right? Or a combination of all of these things at once, right? And what Ready to Die does really is focus on how people, young people, right, communicate through technology, right? And even though, and B.I.G's not the only person who did this, right? Jay-Z, Motorola two-way page me, right? Like, he put that in his song. Number one, he wanted to get paid, right, from the company.
Really, they paid him?
But on top of that, right, I mean, the focus on technology in hip hop really kind of pushes hip hop forward in terms of how marginalized communities depend on communication and technology in the modern, postmodern, or neoliberal world.
Well, that's how we connect and bond with one another, right?
Absolutely.
Through communication. One last area I wanted to go into, mentioning poetry a minute ago. There's this sense in the study of poetry, I guess, that the poet is different from the persona of the poem, right? So a poet might, write a poem about something that she or he has no personal affinity with, but they pick it as a topic for some reason, right? But I get this sense with hip hop music that if a hip hop artist were to say, "Well, I don't really think like that. That's just a song," right? It would be damaging his reputation. Is that, what's your take on that?
That might have been true in the early years of hip hop, right? But you have Drake, right? And I think, right, once you have someone who, comes from a privileged home, which is really the opposite of the representation of hip hop, that is also actually very successful, right? Being a hip hop artist. I mean, you realize that this understanding of Black love, affirmation, community even goes beyond not just space, but, this understanding of, economics, the lumpen proletariats, the underclass, right? The marginalized, because Drake doesn't fit that mold. Right, but he became one of the most popular.
He's not depoliticizing it. He's just hitting it from a more creative, artistic angle. Is that?
I mean, he still writes about, or raps and writes about things that other hip hop artists who have experienced those things,
Yeah.
right? Also write and rap about, right? But there is absolutely room to perform.
Okay.
Right?
All right. That is all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Calvente for joining us today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.